When Melissa walked through the door at 10:52 p.m., I was sitting on the couch with my laptop open, half working, half watching some random YouTube video I wasn't even paying attention to. We had been married for 8 years, living in a modest townhouse in Raleigh that her parents had helped us with the down payment on. No kids, no dramatic financial struggles, no luxury cars in the driveway either. I worked as a mid-level project coordinator at a regional construction firm. It was stable, predictable, and I was content with that. I never needed flashy titles or six-figure bragging rights to feel secure. She didn't look upset when she came in. She kicked off her heels by the door like always, unclipped her earrings, set her purse down on the kitchen counter. Everything felt normal. I asked how the reunion was, expecting a story about who gained weight, who got divorced, who was pretending their startup was successful. Instead, she let out this small laugh that didn't sound happy and said, almost casually, that everyone there was doing better than us and that she was honestly embarrassed to be my wife. There wasn't any build-up. No argument beforehand. Just that sentence landing in the middle of our living room like something physical. I remember the exact hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the way the overhead light flickered slightly because I had been meaning to replace that bulb. She expected something from me, I could see it in her posture. She stood there with her arms loosely crossed, chin slightly raised, waiting for me to react. I think she thought I would get defensive, maybe angry, maybe promise to try harder, maybe start listing everything I had done for us. Instead, I closed my laptop slowly and set it on the coffee table. I felt strangely calm, like my brain had decided to protect me by turning everything into simple logic. If she was embarrassed to be my wife, then what exactly were we protecting? A mortgage? Appearances? 8 years of habit? I told her that if that was how she truly felt, then she shouldn't be my wife anymore. I said we should get divorced. My voice didn't shake. I didn't raise it. It came out steady and almost detached, which shocked her more than if I had yelled. She froze, literally froze in place, like her body hadn't caught up with what she had just heard. I could see the calculation happening in her eyes. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. She thought she had leverage. Her parents had helped with the house. Most of her friends were climbing corporate ladders, posting vacation photos from Europe, announcing promotions on LinkedIn. She probably assumed I would scramble to compete, to prove I was ambitious enough to keep up with whatever standard she had decided mattered. But something in me shifted in that moment. 8 years is a long time to build a life with someone, and yet it only took one sentence to make me realize that I was apparently a source of embarrassment to the person who was supposed to be my partner. Not a teammate who wanted to grow with me, not someone frustrated but supportive, but embarrassed. There was no yelling after that. No dramatic tears. Just a thick silence sitting between us on that couch. I remember thinking how strange it was that a marriage could pivot so cleanly on one honest sentence. She had said what she really thought, and I had responded with what I believed was the only logical consequence. That calmness wasn't indifference. It was clarity. And in that moment, everything that followed was already decided. That night wasn't really about one sentence, even though that was the moment everything snapped into focus for me. When I told her we should get divorced, it sounded sudden, but the truth is it had been building quietly for years and I had been ignoring it because it was easier to call it stress or personality differences than to admit what it actually was. What she said at 10:52 p.m. was just the first time she didn't bother softening it. I started replaying things in my head almost immediately, like my brain was pulling receipts I had filed away but never fully examined. 2 months earlier her friend Tiffany had come over in a brand new BMW, gleaming and unnecessarily loud in our small townhouse complex, and Melissa had stood at the window watching her park while I grabbed drinks from the fridge. She glanced at my Ford sitting in the driveway and laughed under her breath, calling it depressing in that tone that was meant to sound like a joke but wasn't. I laughed it off at the time because it seemed petty to argue about a car that ran perfectly fine and was fully paid off, but I remember the way it sat with me afterward. There was also the time I overheard her on the phone with her sister. She didn't know I had come home early. I walked in quietly and heard her say that I had settled into mediocrity, like it was a diagnosis. She said it casually, almost clinically, as if I had chosen some kind of comfortable failure. I stood in the hallway longer than I should have, listening to her describe my steady job and lack of ambition like character flaws. When she noticed me later, she acted normal, and I convinced myself I had misunderstood the tone. At dinner parties she had this habit of correcting me in front of people. Not over big factual errors, but small things that didn't matter. If I mentioned a project timeline, she would jump in to clarify. If I told a story, she would adjust the details. It always came with a tight smile, like she was polishing something rough. I told myself she just liked accuracy, that I was being sensitive, but I could feel the subtle shift in how people looked at me afterward, like I needed supervision. And whenever I said I was happy with our life, that I liked our quiet routines and our manageable mortgage and our predictable weekends, she would roll her eyes slightly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that happiness at that level was naive. She treated contentment like complacency. Over time I started talking less about what I enjoyed because I didn't want to trigger that look. It wasn't screaming matches or explosive fights. It was erosion. Small comparisons here, a dismissive comment there, constant references to what her friends' husbands were earning or buying or achieving. It was death by 1,000 comparisons, and I kept absorbing it because none of it seemed severe enough on its own to justify a confrontation. Together, though, they painted a clear picture. So when I told her that I would be contacting divorce attorneys in the morning, it wasn't a dramatic threat. It was the first time I responded proportionally to the pattern instead of the individual comment. She switched tactics immediately. Her tone softened, her eyebrows pulled together, and she told me I was overreacting, that it was just one comment, that everyone says things they don't mean after a long night. But I wasn't overreacting. For the first time, I was reacting correctly. I wasn't responding to a single sentence spoken at a reunion. I was responding to years of being measured, compared, and quietly diminished in my own home. And once I saw that pattern clearly, I couldn't unsee it. I woke up Sunday morning before my alarm, the room still dim and quiet, and for a few seconds I just stared at the ceiling, letting the reality of the previous night settle into something solid. There was no dramatic pit in my stomach, no panic, just a steady sense of direction that I hadn't felt in a long time. By 7:15 a.m. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee, my laptop open again, but this time I wasn't half working or distracting myself. I was researching family law attorneys in Wake County with a level of focus I usually reserved for project deadlines. I read reviews carefully, checked credentials, looked at case histories, and paid attention to how long each firm had been practicing. I wasn't doing it to scare her or to prove a point. I was doing it because if I was going to make a decision that would dismantle 8 years of marriage, I was going to do it properly. By 8:30 a.m. I had submitted 3 consultation requests, filling out contact forms with our names, the length of our marriage, the fact that we had no children, and the note that there was jointly owned property involved. Typing those details felt strangely procedural, like I was outlining a project plan instead of describing my own life. Melissa was still asleep when I finished. The house felt different already, like I was observing it rather than inhabiting it. I walked through the living room and noticed small things I had stopped seeing over the years, the indentation on the couch cushion where she always sat, the framed vacation photos her mother insisted we hang, the dining table we barely used. It didn't feel like loss. It felt like distance. By early afternoon I had scheduled a same-day viewing for a 1-bedroom apartment in the warehouse district overlooking a small greenway. I drove there alone, my supposedly depressing Ford humming steadily beneath me, and as I pulled into the lot I felt a quiet sense of anticipation instead of dread. The apartment had hardwood floors that caught the natural light in a way our townhouse never did, and large windows that looked out over trees and a narrow walking path where a couple joggers passed by. It wasn't extravagant, but it was clean, bright, and affordable on my salary alone. I walked through each room slowly, imagining my furniture fitting into the space, imagining mornings without tension hanging in the air, imagining evenings where contentment didn't need to be defended. The leasing agent talked about utilities and parking, but my mind was already made up. I signed the lease that same day, reading every line carefully before putting my name down. The act of signing felt deliberate, not impulsive. It was the first decision in years that felt entirely mine. When I got back home, she was in the kitchen scrolling through her phone like nothing had changed. I told her I had secured an apartment and that I would be moving out in 2 weeks. I kept my tone steady, almost businesslike, because that was the only way I could say it without emotion clouding it. Her voice cracked immediately when she asked if I was serious. There was disbelief in her eyes, but also something else, something closer to fear. I realized then that my calmness unsettled her more than any anger could have. If I had yelled or thrown accusations, it would have fit into a familiar dynamic where she could negotiate, deflect, or escalate. But I wasn't chasing approval anymore. I wasn't trying to prove I was ambitious enough or successful enough or impressive enough to earn her pride. I had chosen peace instead, and the finality of that choice was what truly shook her. The week after I signed the lease was when she shifted from disbelief to strategy. I could see it in the way she moved around the house, more alert, more calculated, like she was trying to identify which lever would pull me back into place. At first it was subtle. Then it became organized. Mutual friends started texting me, asking if I was okay, telling me Melissa said I had been acting unstable and impulsive. That word stood out to me because it was so carefully chosen. Unstable implied irrational, emotional, not to be taken seriously. It reframed my decision as a breakdown instead of a boundary. I didn't argue with anyone. I simply told them that this was not sudden and that I was handling it privately. The fact that she was calling people at all told me she was more concerned about the narrative than the marriage itself. Her mother called me 2 days later. The tone was tight and controlled, the way it always was when she was trying to assert authority without raising her voice. She accused me of throwing away 8 years over one comment, repeating that phrase like it was the official storyline. I listened quietly and told her this had nothing to do with a single sentence and everything to do with a pattern. She dismissed that immediately, saying every marriage has patterns, that I was being dramatic. It struck me how quickly they both minimized it when the outcome no longer benefited them. Then Melissa suggested couples counseling. She presented it like a reasonable compromise, sitting across from me at the kitchen table where I had researched attorneys just days earlier. She said we owed it to our history to at least try. The problem was that counseling is meant to repair something both people value. I no longer believed she valued me, only the version of our life that looked acceptable to others. I told her calmly that counseling would have made sense before telling me she was embarrassed to be my wife, not after I had decided to leave. She started leaving handwritten notes on my desk, small folded pieces of paper telling me she was sorry if she had hurt me, that she was just overwhelmed at the reunion, that she believed in us. The wording was careful, always slightly vague, never fully owning the years of subtle erosion. At night she initiated intimacy in a way that felt strategic rather than emotional, like physical closeness could override clarity. I didn't respond with anger. I simply didn't participate. When none of that shifted me, she escalated in a way I hadn't expected. One afternoon, while I was at work reviewing project schedules, the receptionist messaged me that my wife was in the lobby asking to see me. She hadn't told me she was coming. I walked down and saw her standing near the front desk, visibly upset, her voice raised just enough that a few coworkers had already noticed. She said we needed to talk immediately, that I was humiliating her by dragging this out. I stepped closer and asked her quietly if this was embarrassing for her, talking to her husband at his workplace. The question landed differently than anything else I had said. I watched the realization move across her face in real time. For years she had weaponized appearances, measuring our worth by how it looked to others, correcting me publicly, comparing me in social settings, framing success as something to be displayed. Now the optics were turned on her, and she was the one standing in a lobby drawing attention. I wasn't loud. I wasn't cruel. I simply asked the question and let it sit there between us. The irony didn't need to be explained. For the first time since this started, she didn't have an immediate tactic ready. And I understood then that what unsettled her most was not losing me emotionally, but losing control of how everything appeared. While I was packing up the townhouse, sorting through drawers that hadn't been opened in years, I found a storage box pushed to the back of the hall closet that I had almost forgotten about. Inside it was my old film photography equipment that I had bought 5 years earlier during a period when I felt restless and wanted something that belonged to me alone. There was my camera body, heavier than I remembered, a couple of prime lenses wrapped in faded microfiber cloths, and several unopened rolls of black and white film. I ran my fingers over the metal surface and felt a kind of quiet recognition. When I first bought that camera, Melissa had called it a pointless phase. She said it was an expensive distraction and asked what exactly I planned to do with it, since I was not trying to be a professional photographer. At the time I shrugged it off and told her it was just something I enjoyed learning. Over time I stopped bringing it up because every mention was met with a subtle smirk or a comment about how long this hobby would last. Eventually the camera ended up in that box, not because I lost interest, but because it felt easier than defending something that didn't produce status or income. After I moved into the new apartment, with its hardwood floors and wide windows that let in clean morning light, I unpacked the camera carefully and placed it on the small desk near the living room window. The first Saturday there, I woke up before sunrise without an alarm and decided to take it out. I drove toward Oakwood while the sky was still shifting from blue to gold. The streets were quiet, the old houses lined with porches and trees that cast long shadows across the pavement. The early light felt patient, almost forgiving, and I found myself slowing down, adjusting settings manually, listening to the soft mechanical click of the shutter. There was no one evaluating me, no one comparing my output to someone else's highlight reel. I was just observing how light touched brick, how it filtered through leaves, how it wrapped around the edges of people walking their dogs. It felt grounding in a way I hadn't realized I needed. A few days later I met my neighbor, Daniel Brooks, in the hallway of the building. He was 38, easygoing, the kind of person who looked you in the eye when you spoke. He noticed the camera strap around my shoulder one morning and asked if I shot film. When I told him I had recently started again, his face lit up and he mentioned a small Sunday photo walk group that met at Iron Gate Coffee. He said it was casual, just a handful of people who liked wandering around the city and talking about composition and technique. The following Sunday I went, not expecting much, but the atmosphere was relaxed and unpretentious. That was where I met Ava Mitchell, a 35-year-old photography instructor who carried herself with effortless confidence that didn't feel performative. When she asked me about my work, she didn't ask what I did for a living or what kind of car I drove or whether photography was monetized. She asked what drew me to film and what kind of light I found most interesting to shoot. We stood outside the cafe discussing shadows and grain structure like it was the most natural thing in the world. Within weeks of joining those walks, I realized something had shifted in me. I felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with achievement or comparison. No one there evaluated me against a scale of income or status. They listened when I spoke about why I liked early morning light, and they responded with curiosity instead of correction. For the first time in a long time, I felt present rather than measured, and that quiet recognition felt more validating than any approval I had been chasing before. 8 weeks after we separated, Ava told me she was curating a small local gallery exhibit in Raleigh's Arts District and asked if she could include a few of my urban landscape photos. When she first said it, I thought she was just being encouraging, but she was serious. She had selected 3 images I had shot during those early mornings in Oakwood and downtown, all of them centered around light cutting through quiet streets and reflecting off brick and glass in a way that made ordinary buildings look intentional. I agreed, trying to keep my expectations measured, telling myself it was a small event, nothing dramatic. On opening night, I stood inside the gallery space feeling slightly out of place at first, listening to the low hum of conversation and the soft echo of footsteps against polished concrete floors. My photos were mounted along a white wall near the center of the room, each framed simply, each lit by a focused overhead light that made the shadows in the images feel deeper. I watched as people paused in front of them, leaning in slightly, pointing out details to one another. A couple asked me about my composition choices, about why I preferred shooting during the first hour after sunrise. Someone else asked what film stock I used and how I balanced exposure against the natural glare of morning light. The questions weren't dismissive or polite filler. They were engaged and specific. People listened when I explained how I waited for the right moment when a single figure would enter the frame, how I liked the tension between empty space and structure. For the first time in years, I felt respected in a way that had nothing to do with my job title or my income. It was about how I saw the world and how I translated that into something tangible. I was in the middle of answering another question when I noticed her near the entrance. Melissa stood just inside the gallery, polished as always, her outfit carefully put together, her posture straight, but there was a brittleness in the way she held herself, like she wasn't sure where to place her hands. She scanned the room and then her eyes landed on me, then shifted to the wall where my photos were displayed. She walked over slowly and said she didn't know I was showing work. Her tone was controlled, but there was an undercurrent of something unsettled beneath it. I told her she never thought it mattered. I didn't say it with bitterness. I said it plainly, because that was the truth. She looked around at the small crowd gathered near my photographs, at the way strangers were discussing them with genuine interest. I could see her processing the scene, recalibrating it against whatever image she had of me in her mind. She said she had forgotten I was talented. The word forgotten lingered in the air between us. I told her she hadn't forgotten. She just didn't value what didn't impress her friends. I kept my voice steady, not loud enough to draw attention, but clear enough that there was no room for misinterpretation. The statement wasn't meant to wound her. It was an observation I had arrived at long before that night. She stood there for a moment longer, glancing again at the people studying my work, at Ava speaking animatedly with another guest across the room, at the small red stickers appearing beside pieces that had been sold. There was nothing for her to correct, nothing to minimize, no way to frame it as a phase. After a few minutes, she said she had an early morning and left before the event was halfway over. I stayed until closing, helping Ava take down some of the smaller pieces and pack up the refreshments. As the last lights dimmed and the room emptied, I felt something settle inside me that had nothing to do with revenge or validation. It was simply the quiet confirmation that the parts of me once dismissed as pointless had always mattered. 3 months after I moved out, we sat across from each other in a quiet mediation office with neutral walls and a long polished table that reflected the overhead lights in a way that made everything feel overly exposed. By then the logistics were straightforward. We had no children, which removed the most complicated layer from the process, and our finances had always been relatively separate aside from the townhouse. The agreement was simple. She would keep the townhouse, the one her parents had partially funded, and I would walk away without contesting it. Our individual bank accounts would remain our own. There were no hidden assets, no dramatic disputes over property. On paper, it was clean. The mediator reviewed each section in a calm, procedural tone while we initialed pages one by one. I noticed how different this felt from the emotional chaos of the first week. There were no raised voices now, no attempts to control the narrative. Just signatures and dates and formal language reducing 8 years of shared life to clauses and bullet points. Before the final documents were brought out for signature, she asked if we could speak privately. We stepped into a smaller conference room down the hall. The air felt heavier in there, quieter. She didn't sit immediately. She stood near the window for a moment, then turned toward me with an expression I hadn't seen in years, something less polished and more uncertain. She told me she had started therapy. She said she had been unpacking why she was so focused on status and appearances, why other people's opinions felt like measurements of her own worth. She mentioned her parents, the pressure to look successful, the constant comparisons growing up. She said she realized she had projected that onto our marriage and onto me. Her voice trembled slightly as she said she could change, that she was working on it, that she understood now how much she had diminished things that mattered to me. I listened without interrupting. I didn't doubt that she might be telling the truth. People can gain insight. People can confront patterns. I believed she might genuinely be trying to understand herself for the first time without the filter of competition. When she finished, there was a long pause where it felt like the entire future was being weighed in silence. I told her maybe she could change, and I meant it. But I also told her I was not willing to wait another 8 years to find out. I said it calmly, not as a punishment, but as a boundary I had finally learned how to draw. Change takes time, and trust takes even longer to rebuild. I had already spent years trying to quietly earn validation that should have been given freely. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly, as if she had already anticipated that answer but needed to ask anyway. We walked back into the main room and signed the final documents. Her hand shook slightly as she wrote her name. She cried quietly while the mediator gathered the papers and explained the next administrative steps. I didn't cry. Not because I didn't care, and not because the marriage had meant nothing to me. It had meant a great deal. But I was no longer standing in front of someone trying to prove my worth. I wasn't defending my job, my hobbies, or my level of ambition. I wasn't negotiating my value against someone else's expectations. The absence of tears wasn't coldness. It was the steady feeling of being finished with something that had taken everything it was going to take from me. 6 months after mediation, the divorce was finalized without drama, just a digital notification from my attorney confirming that the paperwork had been processed and the marriage was legally over. There was no cinematic moment attached to it, no sudden wave of emotion, just a quiet acknowledgement that a chapter of my life had formally closed. By then, my routines felt steady in a way they never had before. The apartment overlooking the greenway had started to feel fully mine, not temporary, not transitional, but intentional. In those months, photography had shifted from a private refuge into something more substantial. A regional arts magazine featured a small spread that included one of my urban landscapes, crediting me by name and asking about my approach to early morning light. 2 of my prints sold at a larger exhibit in the arts district, and the emails from buyers felt surreal not because of the money, but because someone had chosen to bring something I created into their home. Ava invited me to co-teach beginner workshops with her on weekends, guiding small groups through the basics of composition and exposure, watching people experience the same quiet satisfaction I had rediscovered. One morning, I stood on my apartment balcony with a cup of coffee, the air still cool, the greenway below dotted with early joggers moving through filtered sunlight. Ava stepped out behind me wrapped in one of my oversized t-shirts, her hair unstyled, her presence unforced. She rested her arms lightly around my waist without saying anything, and we both watched the light shift across the trees. There was no performance in that moment, no comparison, no invisible scoreboard measuring where we ranked against anyone else. I realized then that Melissa had been right about one thing. The marriage had not been working. It had been sustained by habit, by appearances, by the assumption that dissatisfaction was normal as long as it looked stable from the outside. What she never expected was that I would agree with her assessment, that I would take her words at face value and act on them instead of scrambling to contradict them. The best decision I ever made was believing her when she told me exactly how she saw me. She had said she was embarrassed to be my wife, and instead of arguing that I was worthy, instead of listing my strengths or promising to become more impressive, I accepted the clarity of that statement. I stopped trying to convince someone to value what they had already dismissed. Standing there on the balcony, feeling the steady weight of Ava's arms and the warmth of the sun climbing higher, I understood that peace is not loud. It does not announce itself with dramatic victories. It shows up quietly in the absence of tension, in conversations about light instead of status, in mornings that begin without the need to defend who you are. I did not leave my marriage to prove a point. I left because I finally understood that staying where you are considered embarrassing slowly reshapes you into someone smaller. Choosing to walk away was not an act of anger. It was an act of self-respect. And in the stillness of that morning, watching the world wake up below me, I knew I would never again stay in a place where my worth depended on how impressive it looked to someone else.